Okay, have you ever been in that situation where you feel like someone's just using you, like you're a stepping stone for what they want? Or maybe you've been on the other side where you realize you are kind of relying on someone else to get something you need. It's funny how these everyday things bump into this deep philosophical idea that we're going to get into today.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and that's exactly what we're going to explore in this deep dive, the concept of treating persons as means. It's been around for a long time, a lot of thinkers have tackled it, but Immanuel Kant is really central to the conversation. And our guide for this exploration is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on treating persons as means. It's a pretty comprehensive resource.
Yeah, it looks pretty thorough. So for this deep dive, we're going to try to unpack what it actually means to treat someone as a means. When does it become morally problematic? Like, when are we treating someone merely as a means? Why should we even care about that distinction? We'll get into the philosophical weeds a bit, but we want to make it clear enough that anyone can understand the ethics involved. No philosophy degree needed. Okay, let's get into it. Maybe we could start with Kant. He's the big name that comes to mind when we talk about this.
For sure. You can't talk about this without mentioning Kant's famous formula of humanity. This is a core principle in his moral philosophy, you know. It comes from his book, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. And the way he phrases it is so act that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. Now, for Kant, this isn't just some suggestion. It's not like, oh, it's a good idea to be nice to people. This is like a fundamental rule for him. It's always wrong to treat someone merely as a means.
Wow, so that seems like a high bar to clear, right? But it's interesting because, as our source points out, Kant isn't saying that anytime you interact with someone to achieve a goal, it's automatically wrong. I mean, think about our daily lives. We're constantly relying on other people to get things done. You get your coffee from a barista, you have someone design your website.
Yeah, exactly. The key for Kant is merely. That's the real issue, reducing a person to just an instrument for your own benefit. And just to add to that, the Stanford entry mentions that some people who study Kant even say that the positive side of this, like the duty to treat others as ends in themselves, that's even more central to his ideas. It's not just avoiding treating them as tools, it's about actively recognizing and respecting their worth and their ability to make their own choices.
Yeah, I could see that. And it's kind of mind-blowing that Kant extends this idea even to how we treat ourselves. He said we can actually treat ourselves merely as means by acting against our own duties, like lying or harming ourselves. But we're going to mostly focus on how this applies to how we treat other people.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what using another person actually looks like when it's not morally charged. There has to be a line somewhere, right?
There is. It's really important to separate the two. The entry makes it clear that if you're just benefiting from someone's actions, that doesn't automatically mean you're using them as a means. Like, think about your example with the runner enjoying the sound of someone singing. The runner is happy, but they're not intentionally using the singer to get that enjoyment. We see this all the time. A waiter and a customer, or teacher and a student. These are relationships where people rely on each other for different goals. It's okay.
I see what you mean, yeah. Like both sides kind of get something out of it, even if it's not explicitly stated. So when does using another person actually count as using them in that neutral way, the kind that could become morally problematic?
Yeah. Okay, so the entry gives us a starting point for a definition. An agent uses another or treats her as a means when the agent intentionally does something to the other to achieve their own goals. Think of it like a passenger intentionally gets on a bus, right? They need the driver to take them somewhere. Or telling a white lie to a friend to spare their feelings, you're doing something to them through deception. Or even if you hit someone in self-defense to escape, that also fits this definition.
That makes sense, yeah. That gives us some structure. But it brings up some tough situations, right? Like unintended consequences. The entry uses the example of a pilot attacking enemy soldiers, but then civilians get hurt too. It wasn't the goal, but are they being used as a means in that situation?
Right, so the definition needs some refining. The entry points out that just doing something to another person might not be enough to call it using them as a means in the way we're talking about. The agent has to intend to use some aspect of the other person to get to their goal, their presence, their actions, something about them. In the pilot example, the pilot isn't trying to hurt civilians to achieve their objective. It's a horrible side effect.
So it's about whether you're specifically relying on that other person to reach your goal.
Exactly. So this leads to a better definition. An agent uses another if and only if she intentionally does something to or with the other to realize her end, and she intends the other's presence or participation to contribute to that end. Like, picture an usher who's rushing to help a kid and shoves a spectator out of the way. They're doing something to the spectator, but they're not trying to use them to get to the kid. The spectator's just in the way. But if you ask someone for directions, you need their knowledge, their participation to find your destination.
Okay, so that's pretty clear. But then the entry says that even helping someone, like a doctor treating a patient, could be considered using them in this morally neutral way. How does that fit in?
Well, the doctor is doing something to the patient, giving them treatment to help them heal, right? And the patient's body and their participation, like giving their medical history, are essential for that to work. So it's using them in a way that benefits them, but it still matches the definition. It shows that using doesn't always have to be a bad thing in this context.
Yeah, that's a good point. We shouldn't think of using here the same way we do in our everyday conversations. It's different. And the entry also talks about the different ways we can use others.
Huh.
Rational, emotional, physical capacities. Can you give some examples of those?
Sure, think about asking someone for advice. You're engaging their rational capacities, their ability to think things through. Politicians sometimes try to stir up feelings of patriotism to get votes, right? That's using people's emotional capacities. And a surgeon using a patient's organ for a transplant is a good example of using their physical capacities. It's all about using some aspect of the other person to get to your own goal.
And then they even bring up some really current issues like how companies use our data. Like if researchers are analyzing someone's genetic information, is that considered using that person?
Yeah, that's a big question in our data-driven world. The entry raises this as a point of discussion. It's like if we think of that information as still connected to the person, then using it in research could be considered using the person. And that would make this whole idea of treating persons merely as means relevant to things like data privacy and using biological samples. It just makes things even more complex. Okay, so we have a decent understanding of using someone in a morally neutral way. But the big question is, when does it become morally wrong? When does it become treating merely as means? Right, so this is where Kant's famous example of the false promise comes in from the groundwork. He says if you make a promise you know you're not going to keep, you're using the other person merely as a means. And his reasoning is that if they knew the truth, they wouldn't agree to it, right? They wouldn't want to be treated that way, so they can't really contain in himself the end of the action. This idea of containing the end has led to a lot of debate about what actually makes using someone morally wrong.
So let's break that down. This idea that someone can't share the agent's purpose. What exactly does that mean? How have philosophers interpreted this, and how does it connect to being treated merely as a means?
Okay, so there are a few different interpretations. One way to look at it is whether the other person can logically share the agent's goal. Like in the false promise example, the person lending the money can't logically share the borrower's goal of getting the money without ever paying it back, because loans are supposed to be paid back. If the lender really agreed to that, it wouldn't be a loan, it would be a gift, so it's a contradiction.
Yeah, that makes sense. But wait a minute. The entry throws in this mugging example, right? Couldn't it be logically possible that the person being mugged actually wants to give their money away? Like, maybe they have a really weird reason. Wouldn't that mean the mugger isn't treating them merely as a means under this logical impossibility idea?
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how these philosophical concepts can get messy when you try to apply them to real-life situations, or even these thought experiments. The entry recognizes that point and says that just because something is unlikely doesn't mean it's logically impossible. Some philosophers try to address this by saying that some intentions are just built into certain actions, like the lender has to want the money back, otherwise it's not really a loan. So maybe the false promise really does involve a logical impossibility in a way that the mugging, even though it's strange, doesn't.
So these abstract ideas can be really hard to define when we try to get specific. What are some other ways philosophers have interpreted this inability to share an end?
Another big one is the idea of preventing choice.
Hmm.
The idea here is that if you take away someone's ability to decide whether they want to be part of your plan, then you are treating them merely as a means. Like in the false promise, the deception takes away the lender's opportunity to make a real decision.
Okay, so that seems straightforward. But then the entry talks about those hikers who are secretly following someone down a mountain. They prevent the person from choosing to help them, even though they benefit from the guidance. So does that mean they're treating him merely as a means?
Well, that's a tricky part. It seems like it could lead to that conclusion, which might feel counterintuitive. To avoid this, some philosophers have added a condition. They say it's only wrong when you prevent someone from choosing, and they have a right not to be prevented from making that choice. So it adds this whole other layer of rights, which can make things more complicated because now we're bringing in other moral concepts.
So every time we think we have it figured out, there's a new wrinkle. What's another way philosophers have thought about this inability to share an end?
Okay, the third major one is practical irrationality. The idea is that someone can't share your goal if doing so would be completely irrational for them, like it would go against their own values and well-being. In the false promise, it doesn't make sense for the lender to knowingly agree to something where they won't get their money back. It would hurt them financially.
That reminds me of Kant's idea of the hypothetical imperative, right?
Right.
If you want something, you should also want what you need to get it. So willingly going along with something that goes against your own interests wouldn't be rational.
Exactly. And the entry uses the example of a doctor who wants to take organs from a healthy patient without their consent. It would be totally irrational for the patient to want to stay alive and also agree to having your organs removed. So this idea of practical irrationality leads to a more nuanced definition, focusing on those immediate goals the agent has in using the other person.
But even this idea runs into problems, especially in competitive situations, right? If your goal in a game is to be the only winner, your opponent can't share that same goal. Does that mean every competition, even if everyone's playing fair, is treating the opponent merely as a means?
That's a really interesting point, and the entry does bring it up. If you're only looking at whether the goals can be shared, then even playing a fair game could be seen as morally wrong. It just shows how hard it is to come up with one definition that fits our gut feelings about what's right and wrong in all these different situations.
So end sharing is complex, and there isn't always a simple yes or no answer.
Right.
What about the other thing Kant mentioned, the inability to consent? How have philosophers used that to understand treating someone merely as a means?
Right. So the entry talks about something called the possible consent account. It says if someone can't consent to being used, meaning they can't say no and avoid it, then they're being treated merely as a means. Deception and coercion are the obvious examples. If you're tricked, you can't really consent. And if you're forced, your no doesn't matter.
And the mugging we talked about earlier fits too. The victim can't really consent to being robbed.
Exactly. But this idea of possible consent has problems too. Like, what about someone giving CPR to an unconscious person? That's not wrong, even though the person can't consent.
So just because someone can't consent doesn't mean it's always wrong.
Right. It has to be connected to the agent's actions in a specific way to be morally problematic. So some philosophers have adjusted it to say, treating someone merely as a means happens when the agent's actions are what make the other person unable to consent. So that addresses the CPR problem because the person giving CPR didn't cause the other person to be unconscious.
That makes sense. But then they bring up that messed up example of using a date rape drug. Attacker didn't cause the victim to be unconscious in the first place, but it's obviously wrong.
Yeah, that's a big flaw. It shows that just focusing on whether the agent caused the inability to consent doesn't cover every situation where someone is clearly being treated as an object. The entry also mentions some tricky cases of deception, like lying about a surprise party or lying to a criminal to protect a witness. In those cases, the person being deceived could actually agree with the final goal, so it's not as clear if the lack of consent makes it treating them merely as a means.
It's just so complicated. It seems like focusing on possible consent doesn't always work.
Yeah.
So what about actual consent? If someone doesn't actually say yes, is that always treating them merely as a means?
So the entry looks at that too. It suggests that if someone doesn't actually consent to being used, then they are being treated merely as a means. But then you think about a situation where a patient is unconscious and needs emergency treatment, and it just falls apart. It seems like it's okay, even necessary, to treat someone without their explicit consent in those situations.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then they bring up even more specific situations, like when someone can't consent, or there are really strong reasons to not wait for consent. But they point out that using someone as a human shield without their consent is always wrong, no matter what.
Exactly. It shows that while actual consent is super important, it's not the only thing that determines whether someone is being treated merely as a means. There are times when using someone without their consent just feels wrong, even if they're not able to consent or other conditions are met.
So the entry then talks about a really important distinction between all these different accounts, whether they depend on other moral ideas or if they try to define treating merely as means without relying on those other concepts.
Right, that's a key difference. Some philosophers straight up define treating merely as means as using someone in a way that breaks a moral rule that we owe to them. So to use that definition, you have to already know what those moral rules are, which often come from Kant's ideas about human dignity and stuff. The problem there is that it all depends on whether everyone agrees on those basic moral rules.
And then there are those who try to define it on its own, without bringing in other moral ideas, and just look at the intentions, the way people interact, and the capacities of the person being used.
Yeah, those accounts try to come up with a definition that's more objective. But as we've been talking about, they also have a hard time matching our natural sense of right and wrong in every situation. Okay, so we've talked a lot about when using someone turns into treating them merely as a means. But does that always mean it's morally wrong? Is that what Kant was getting at?
That's where things get even more interesting,
Ah.
right? The entry brings in some different points of view. Parfit, for example, gives us a really basic definition, focusing on seeing someone as a tool and not caring about their well-being or their rights at all. Could you treat someone merely as a means under this definition without actually doing something morally wrong?
Parfit says maybe. He uses this example of a gangster who sees a barista as just a way to get his coffee. He's treating her as a means, but just buying coffee isn't usually seen as a morally wrong act. Audi has a more detailed account where he focuses on the agent's motivation and whether they have any concern for the other person beyond just using them. So if we think about Kant's false promise again, the person making the promise might not want to see the other person completely screwed over, but Kant would probably still say that the false promise itself is wrong.
So these ideas challenge Kant's absolute rule, right? They're saying maybe treating someone merely as a means isn't always the deciding factor in whether an action is wrong. And the entry even brings up the possible consent account again with that mugging scenario where the victim uses one of the muggers as a shield. It seems like it's okay in that situation, even though the victim is definitely using the mugger without their consent.
That's a really important point. It shows that the situation and the reasons behind the using really matter. And then the entry even throws in this extreme example of using one person to save millions from nuclear war. It's horrible, but a lot of people would say that it might be the right thing to do, or at least permissible. So maybe the wrongness of treating someone merely as a means can be overridden by other really important moral considerations.
So if treating someone merely as a means isn't always wrong, then how do we know when it's okay to use another person, but not merely as a means? One idea that the entry talks about is voluntary informed consent. So if someone freely agrees to it and understands how they're being used, does that mean it's okay?
It seems like it should be, right? But the entry gives some really tough examples. Like, what about situations where someone is being exploited? Like a mother who has to agree to terrible working conditions so her kids can go to school. You could say her consent is voluntary and informed, but it's under extreme pressure and an unfair power dynamic. Does her agreement really make it okay for the other person to exploit her? A lot of people would say no.
Yeah, that shows how consent alone isn't always enough, especially when there are issues like vulnerability and power imbalance. The entry also talks about unnecessary threats, even if the threat doesn't actually change the other person's decision. Like that example of a salesperson threatening to out their manager if they don't buy something. The manager knows it's an empty threat and buys it anyway. They consented, but the salesperson's intention still seems wrong.
That's a great example. It shows the difference between what philosophers call agent-focused and patient-focused accounts of treating merely as means. If you're only looking at the manager's consent, you might say the salesperson didn't do anything wrong. But if you consider the salesperson's intentions, it seems wrong. So it really depends on whether you focus on the person being used or the person doing the using.
The entry also looks at some other ideas, like whether the other person can consent or whether the agent is acting based on moral beliefs. And finally, it talks about the idea of only using others in ways they could rationally consent to.
Yeah, so rational consent is all about whether there are good reasons to consent to being used. It considers both objective reasons and reasons specific to that person's situation. But then the entry uses those classic thought experiments, like the trolley problem and the organ harvesting scenario, to challenge this idea. In those cases, you could argue that there might be good reasons to consent, but it still feels really wrong to a lot of people.
It just shows you how complicated this all is. We've gone through Kant's ideas and all this philosophical debate, and it's clear that there's no easy definition of treating persons merely as a means.
Exactly. The entry concludes by saying it's not one single concept, but a bunch of related ideas that all point to morally questionable ways we interact with and rely on other people.
So after this deep dive, what does it all mean for our listeners? I think understanding these different perspectives gives us a better way to look at our everyday interactions It makes us think about the ethical side of how we rely on others, even in simple situations.
It encourages us to look beyond just getting things done and think about the other person's freedom, their worth, and their well-being. It's about asking ourselves, are we truly respecting them as individuals, or are we just seeing them as tools to get what we want?
And that brings us to something for you to think about. When you rely on someone, or someone relies on you, how do you make sure it's not just about using each other, but also about recognizing their worth as a person? Is consent always enough, or is there something more to it? It's a conversation that doesn't just happen in philosophy classes, it's happening all around us all the time.